Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Career Cert and University of Texas Southwestern for our webinar today. I'm the host for this webinar. My name is Wendy from Career Cert. And at Career Cert, we are focused on providing emergency and healthcare professionals with the training they need to best protect and care for those in their communities. We're grateful for this opportunity to connect with those of you on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic to discuss this important topic. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to our presenters for this webinar. We have Dr. David Brar, Paul Rosenberger, Dr. Gil Salazar, and Virginia Smith. Dr. Brar is an emergency medicine resident at UT Southwestern and Parkland Hospital. He graduated medical school from California North State University and received his bachelor's in biochemistry and molecular biology from UC Davis. His interests in the field of emergency medicine include critical care and academics. He is from Northern California and recently moved to Dallas for residency. Dr. Paul Rosenberger has over 30 years of EMS experience with over 20 years of adult education instruction. Currently, Dr. Rosenberger is the Associate Director of the EMS Continuing Education Program at UT Southwestern and an adjunct faculty member for the Emergency Services Administration BAAS program at the University of North Texas, Dallas, and he is also the co-chair for the National EMS Education Standards Developmental Revision Team. Dr. Gil Salazar serves as the Medical Director of EMS Education at UT Southwestern and oversees both initial and continuing education of area's EMS professionals. He practices clinically at Parkland Hospital Emergency Department. Dr. Salazar is dually board certified in emergency medicine and EMS and serves as core faculty for the emergency medicine residency and the EMS fellowship programs of UT Southwestern Medical Center. Virginia Smith is a licensed paramedic for Cypress Creek EMS in Spring, Texas, which utilizes aggressive emergency protocols. She is working as the in-charge paramedic position in ambulance teams responding to 911 calls. Virginia received her bachelor's in biology from Texas A&M and her master's in biomedical sciences from University of Incarnate Word School of Osteopathic Medicine. Virginia, I hope I got that right. She is a medical school applicant and hopes to be accepted and start in the fall of 2021. And now I will turn the time over to our presenters.
Thank you, Wendy. We appreciate you. We are so delighted and so very grateful to Career Cert for the opportunity once again to join you for a little lunchtime chat today. Our main goal is to bring you information that we think is valuable for your practice, both clinical and operational in EMS. We are very grateful for the work that you do. We are very conscious that you, much like me and Dr. Barr, you form part of the front lines against COVID-19. And this month we wanted to bring you something that we feel is needs a little bit of attention, specifically the COVID-19 vaccine. To give you a little bit of background about why we're doing this, first and foremost, we think that every EMS professional out there deserves a chance to be well educated, to have an evidence-based approach when looking at the vaccine. I personally feel that there is unfortunately, a lot of disinformation surrounding this vaccine, and we wanted to bring you an unbiased approach to talking about the vaccine today. So we hope that you will find it useful. Let's go ahead and take a look at this poll. I want you just to give me your honest opinion while I give you a little more background. Is how would you rate your knowledge of about the vaccine so far? Excellent, good, not very good at all. I think we are all over the place in terms of the amount of resources, education, and level of comfort with this vaccine. I'll be very open and tell you that even my own EMS agency, for which I'm the medical director, I am been successful for only 50% in getting my medics to get vaccinated. So I look forward to hear the results of the poll. Looks like the majority of you feel about average. A couple feel that they're excellent. So in the ones that are not very good, this is what we're all about. So I'm hoping to bring up as many of you as we possibly can into the excellent category. So let's dive into it. This is an interactive webinar, so please put your questions in the chat. We will try to address as many of them as we possibly can. This is for you. We do this for you. And if we can be of any service afterwards, we'd be more than delighted to follow up with you. So today we're going to be talking about two vaccines. The Pfizer BioNTech one and Moderna. And the reason we're doing that is these are, of course, as you know, the most readily available. We also know that they have the same mechanism of action. We're going to discuss this briefly. And we know that if you or your department are going to be involved in the vaccination process, you're going to be receiving one of these. So we want you to have all the information that we have so far in a manner that is consistent with EMS professionals and how they learn. The history is actually very interesting around this. It was very briefly after the virus began to make its way around the wet markets in Wuhan province of China. It wasn't too long after that scientists were able to sequence the genome for SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. And I want you to notice that we're going to be referring to this virus for what it really is a severe acute respiratory syndrome. Much like the SARS pandemic is the exact same methodology, just a different virus, part of the same family. We know that the vaccine itself is reliant upon mRNA, messenger RNA. This technology is not new. There's a lot of disinformation as, oh my goodness, they're testing it out on me and I feel like a guinea pig. Actually, mRNA technology has been around for over 30 years. It received a lot more attention the last 10 years when we started realizing that there's a potential to develop safe, effective vaccines using what we already know is out there, a natural product of our cells and how our cells communicate, and that's mRNA. So I think the first lesson of the day for you is this technology is not brand spanking new. We've been playing with it for a while now, and with this pandemic, we had the unique opportunity to put all of that science, all of that background into play and develop a beautiful product. Next slide, Paul.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about what mRNA is, and this is going to go back to all those bio classes that we all had way back when. But mRNA is messenger RNA, and basically this is the kind of a blueprint our cells use to make different proteins, antibodies, or anything else our body needs. So if you remember way back for when we were doing cell bio, like maybe in high school, every cell has a nucleus which contains our DNA, which contains all the information that we need to make different things in our body. That DNA is then made into mRNA, which goes out into the cytoplasm of the cell, where it can be made into different things. So these vaccines that are using mRNA are injecting a piece of mRNA that gives instruction for the SARS, the COVID virus, the spike protein. So our cells can start producing that, and maybe we can produce an immune response. One important thing, and I've seen a lot of rumors going around that mRNA can go into our DNA. So this isn't true. The mRNA that gets injected into via the vaccine goes into a couple of cells that are in the local site of the injection and gets degraded pretty quickly. It's just used to produce those proteins in a short time span. And
so
that's
something. So if it injures a cell, does it permanently alter the way the cell functions normally?
No, so it shouldn't change how that cell functions. It's just inserting that piece of mRNA for a short period of time so it can produce some of the spike protein, so our body can have that immune response and develop that immunity. And we can go on to the next slide.
When we discuss the development of vaccines, the science of it, I want to be very clear. Every vaccine that you and I have taken throughout our lives, beginning when we were really little, has undergone the same level of scrutiny, and the same can be said about this SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. Let's discuss just the Pfizer vaccine for now, the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. We know that this group enrolled 43,500 subjects, and there were two arms, those that received the actual mRNA vaccine and those received a placebo. That's a classic way of doing things to test efficacy. Now, the mathematics behind checking and testing for efficacy kind of go beyond the scope of this lecture, but what I can tell you is that what they were basically doing is looking at the two groups and then watching over a period of time to see how many people acquired this infection. And we knew that there were really about 94 or so in the initial phase, and the overwhelming majority of folks who actually acquired the infection were in the placebo group. All right. So that's, once you do the mathematics for it, that results in an effectiveness rating of about 95%, which is amazing for some technology that it's been around for a while. This is a new vaccine. To achieve a 95% efficacy for a vaccine, that's exactly what you want to see. Now, all the governing bodies, including the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC here in the United States, would not approve a vaccine that has an efficacy less than 50%, which is equal to chance alone that it is the vaccine that's causing the high effectiveness. So what I get it from this slide to all our viewers today is that the efficacy is tremendous for this vaccine over placebo. We're going to look at some pretty cool charts here shortly to demonstrate that a little bit better. When you're looking at the vaccine development, we want to address one of the main concerns that people have is the concept that this was rushed. This felt like we were just pushing it out there and just satisfying a bunch of people for either political reasons or somebody had an agenda. I'll be the first one to tell you, I have no dog in this fight other than that I want to stay healthy. I am in the front lines taking care of these folks, and I want to stay healthy for as long as I can. So that was one of the first pieces that were really disappointing to me when the vaccine was being developed and pushed out to us. So let's talk about the phases. Every vaccine goes through four phases here in the United States, particularly 3 are initial and 1 is a continuing or a monitoring phase. If you look at every vaccine developed over time, every vaccine is going to take between 2 and 7 years, mostly around 5 years, which is a tremendous amount of time. And what you should remember is that Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna did not skip any of these phases. In other words, no corners were cut whatsoever. Now, when you want to ship something by mail, you want to send a Christmas present, and you're coming up short on time, and you pay a little bit extra to have it expedited, all right? That is quite a bit different process, okay? You're not really rushing things. You're actually bypassing some of the traditional barriers that would keep your Christmas present from getting there in a timely manner. So there were 3 things that were very unusual that allowed this process to be expedited. Number 1, financial. You have a very hard time financing these. There are not very many companies around the world that want to take a risk in developing vaccines, but there was no shortage of funding from local governments and private industry to fund these studies. So barrier number 1, gone immediately. Second, the number of volunteers. Normally you have to do quite a bit of work to get volunteers and subjects to allow themselves to be vaccinated with something that is relatively new. No, not so much. Out of those 43,500 folks, those folks represent a very small number of actual volunteers that wanted to get injected. There were a lot of inclusion and exclusion criteria to be considered for this study. So there were far more than 43,500 subjects that wanted to be part of this. We had 0 issues getting the subjects that we needed. Third, due to the nature of this pandemic and how much it was kicking our behinds, our governing bodies, particularly the FDA, the CDC, all of our local government agencies and scientific bodies put this at the forefront So all the regulatory aspects that normally take months and even years to overcome, well, this became the #1 priority. And right off the bat, we were able to vet the vaccine very, very carefully and did it very quickly because we knew that this was a main priority for not just the United States, but the rest of the world. So gone immediately were the 3 main roadblocks to getting a vaccine out.
So I want to talk a little bit about this slide. We have a screenshot here of the Pfizer study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. I think the main point I wanted to make with this is that there is a lot of information out there on the net or when you're talking to your friends or colleagues, but it's important to go to some reputable sources that are peer-reviewed, that are, that have the correct information about vaccines and about COVID in general. Believe it or not, I mean, it's hard to say even after when we're rounding a year of having COVID around, it's still relatively new in, the span of medicine. So a lot of information has been coming at us fast, and it's very important that we're getting our information from a reputable source. So places like the CDC, New England Journal, Lancet, and all these other peer-reviewed sources provide studies that are peer-reviewed that allow us to get this information to find out if vaccines or other treatments are safe and effective. And we have a link at the end of the presentation that can take you to a page with frequently asked questions, both from the New England Journal and from the CDC. I myself found this pretty helpful. It has a lot of different questions that people have, whether you've had COVID before and you should get vaccinated, whether or not that you got vaccinated within a certain time frame. They answer all those questions in case you need to reference that. We can go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Hey, Dr. Barr, would you go ahead and talk about the graphic that's in the upper right corner of this slide?
Yes, I believe on the next slide it's a little bit more zoomed in.
Yeah, and the next slide is the graph.
Okay. Second, the graphic at the top of the page, it's basically talking about the mRNA kind of flow that I was talking about earlier. So the circle with the little ribbon in it on the very top contains the strand of mRNA that codes for the portion of the spike protein that's contained in the vaccine, and that it's sitting in a little fat lipid kind of circular ball there. Once that gets injected into your shoulder, it gets taken up by some of the connective tissue, the muscle cells, and some immune cells there. Once that gets taken up, that mRNA is then encoded with a ribosome to make portion of a spike protein. That portion of that spike protein is then shown on that cell for your immune system to react to it. Once your immune system reacts to it, you start to make the antibodies, and that's what gives you that protection from COVID. But it's important to know that this mRNA is only encoding for a portion of the spike protein, not the entire. You're not getting the entire virus injected into you, and that mRNA gets degraded down in a short period of time and doesn't stay inside your cells forever.
And I like how you describe this as a blueprint and then a 3D printer.
Yeah, so a lot of the cells, different parts of the cells are almost like a machine, like an assembly line. mRNA being the blueprint, as you're saying, and the ribosomes being like 3D printers that are printing out these the spike proteins.
And this is a bigger graphic.
Yeah, so this just gives us a closer look. So if anyone wanted to take a look closer, it kind of just shows, you can see that portion of the spike protein is kind of the same image that we keep seeing on the news and all these diagrams with the virus in a circle with the little red kind of nobule sticking out, that we've all become a lot more familiar with than I ever expected that we would. And I think, so this graph that's on the right side of this slide, I think really kind of sells the point of how effective this vaccine is. The blue line is the placebo arm, and the red line is the participants that had gotten the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. On the x-axis, you can see that those are days after they received their dose, and on the y-axis is the incidence of COVID. You can see around day 7 is where these two graphs kind of split up, and you notice that the people that had gotten vaccinated have pretty significant protection from getting symptomatic COVID. I think this graph kind of sells that point, like Dr. Salazar was talking about before, the 95% like effective rate, which is very significant. It's very encouraging to us. I mean, I know Dr. Salazar and my other colleagues at the hospital were very excited when this vaccine came out with that effectiveness. But one thing that is important.
How did they check that? Was it symptomatic COVID only?
Yes, so that is something that's very important. This study looked at symptomatic COVID. So that means they weren't testing every single person that got the vaccine, only people that began to experience symptoms, and same with the placebo arm. So this is one aspect of the study that's kind of a limitation. So we do need to continue to wear our PPE because we're not sure that the vaccine protects us from developing symptoms or prevents us from not getting infected at all. Because if we are still carrying around the virus, we risk spreading it to people that do not have that protection. So at least while we're in this pandemic and COVID's this prevalent, it's very important that even after you've received your vaccine, even after it's been the 2 weeks or the 7 days when you develop your immunity, you still need to be wearing all your PPE, especially when you're around vulnerable people. Some of the other limitations I think are important to look at. This study included a lot of people. I mean, there's more than 40,000 people. They looked at safety data, but it was only looked at for 2 months. And I know this is a concern a lot of people have with the vaccine is that we don't have long-term data. The reason 2 months was selected as a stopping point was most vaccine side effects in the past, with all past vaccines, were noted to be within 2 months. And the data was so encouraging. The vaccine had some mild side effects that we'll talk about in the next couple of slides, but that's why it got approved with the FDA. And then just another limitation to point out, they do talk about the fact that they didn't test people that were under the age of 16, pregnant women, and immunocompromised people. It does not mean the vaccine is not safe in these individuals. It just means that we don't have the data yet to say that for certain.
Thank you, Dr. Brar. I'm going to take a couple of seconds here to discuss some of the items on the chat. The first one, I won't mention your name. Is there anyone who should not get the vaccine? Thank you for that question. Yeah, there are some folks who have history of allergies and anaphylaxis to some of the ingredients in the vaccine. So when you sign up to get the vaccine, before you roll up your sleeve, you're going to get a list of the ingredients within the vaccine. If there are any on there that you have had history of allergies to or anaphylaxis, you're not a good candidate. You can do this pre-screening on the front end if you would like. There are some folks who are immunosuppressed and they're not good candidates to receive this vaccine. That determination needs to be done with your primary care physician or your medical director if you don't have a doctor who knows you very, very well. Second question I have here is, should pregnant or breastfeeding women get the vaccine? We have pretty good evidence that SARS-CoV-2 does not cross the placenta. And so as a result of that, we have pretty good evidence too that it is safe in women who are pregnant. Now, breastfeeding is a bit of a different issue, and that's going to be on a person by person basis, but when it comes to pregnant women, it is safe. I have personal knowledge of several of my colleagues who are pregnant who have received the vaccine, and just like me, they vetted out the science and determined that it's pretty safe. Next question that I have here is, I've heard several people express a belief that these vaccines would somehow change recipients' DNA. And Dr. Brar reminded us that the mechanism of action for messenger RNA, you are not going to even enter the nucleus, and therefore you cannot touch the DNA. Remember that this mRNA gets degraded ridiculously quickly after it does its job. So it doesn't stick around. It's not helping you produce a spike protein more and more and more in months to come. What you wanted is producing that beautiful IgG, those antibodies, so that you can fight off the actual virus if it comes up. And then the last one is, if understanding correctly, this only causes cell to produce the spike protein that triggers the immune response without a full-blown response, traditional vaccine using live or dead virus. That is exactly correct. That's the mechanism of action for these. So as you saw in the picture there, once you get that beautiful spike protein produced. Now your antibodies begin to react to it. It creates a nice response so that next time you see these spikes on an actual virus, you have a much less chance of acquiring the virus or becoming significantly symptomatic for this. Okay. Let's go to our side effects here. You've had a chance to kind of read over them, and I'll tell you from personal experience, and if any of the other panelists have had a different experience, please share them. Soreness for me, for both, for the 2 doses, definitely the soreness at the arm was present. It felt exactly like it does when you have a flu vaccine. I have had colleagues, and in the literature and in the studies, one of the most common was headache and body aches. I did have a colleague with true fever. I've had colleagues with a bit of an urticarial rash, like hives in small parts of their body. And speaking of rash, as of when we were developing this presentation initially, there were only 21 cases reported to the CDC. And this is close to 2 million doses given. We're at more than 2 million doses, pretty close. None of these allergic reactions required significant hospitalization or ICU stay. The majority went to the hospital, were treated, and they were discharged on the same day. Before I move to transverse myelitis, did any of our panelists have any of these side effects that I mentioned?
And Dr. Salazar, I want to reiterate, those side effects that we see are our own body's reaction, and that's pretty much what we see with every vaccine. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Once your IgM and your IgG proteins, your antibodies begin to create a reaction, that's what an immunologic reaction is. It's an inflammatory reaction. So all of the effects that you're seeing, the headache, the fever, the body aches, and even the rash, those are things that you would expect your immune system to do when you're mounting a response against a foreign agent. Paul, what were your side effects?
Yeah, so I had my first shot on December 23rd, the day before Christmas Eve. And by the time I had left the site, my shoulder was a little sore. I would describe it just like a tetanus injection. And then the next day I had some malaise during Christmas Eve day, and that was really all I had. About a week ago, I had my second injection. My shoulder this time was a little bit more sore than the first time. But I had no malaise. In fact, I went on and had a great day. And so I know some people have talked about, the second injection is worse than the first. That was not my experience.
Yeah, and I had pretty similar symptoms as well. With both doses, my arm was sore. With the second dose, I noticed the next day I had some mild fatigue and very mild body aches. But I never developed a fever or anything significant, and it only lasted maybe 12 or 14 hours. Unfortunately, I was working that day, but still feel great now.
Yeah, same deal. I think the level of symptomatology after the vaccine, in my personal opinion, has been relatively mild. And thank you for pointing out, yeah, the anaphylaxis cases was 1/6/21. That's my mistake. I own it. I will make it next time. One question in there was, this vaccine is not a cure. It just introduces soldiers to fight it if a recipient is later exposed to COVID-19. Absolutely. That's exactly what we want you to get away from this. We're not curing COVID-19. We're preventing infections. That's the only way we're going to get through. There's a question in the chat about transverse myelitis, and you personally have a history of transverse myelitis. So let's address that specific question. Now, for some highly educated folks who do their reading and they know about these, you've heard of the terms Guillain-Barré syndrome, for example, and transverse myelitis. These are infections of the neurological system that affect places like your spinal cord, and the results can be actually pretty devastating. Transverse myelitis is something that we've seen in the past with other vaccines. And certainly when some of these vaccines were being developed, we were very closely looking at them. There was one case in the literature of the AstraZeneca, which is a completely different mechanism of action than the Moderna and the Pfizer. Okay, it's a completely different trial, different type of vaccine. All right, we can do another webinar at another time to discuss that one. They had a case of transverse myelitis. What you got to remember is that transverse myelitis can occur when you're exposed to several things, including viruses. So when you are a subject and you get a vaccine during a trial and you develop transverse myelitis, it raises a lot of eyebrows. So that specific study had to be halted for a short period of time. We will not know if this was related to the vaccine. Okay, this individual might have been walking around with some of the viruses that we normally have in our bodies and can trigger transverse myelitis. But since then, there have been no other cases for transverse myelitis, none for the Pfizer and the Moderna, which we're discussing today. And so to answer your question with transverse myelitis, yeah, it is my opinion that they should have asked this. I don't know why that was an oversight. Might it be because this wasn't a significant expected side effect for that, but definitely should be reported. All right, next slide, Paul. Before we let's do, I want to see what you all are feeling about the side effects for this one now that we've discussed them a little bit. I'm gonna select the one that's the one that applies to you the most. Your understanding is that they were life-threatening. Go ahead, Virginia.
Yeah, absolutely. I can start talking about benefits while they're doing that poll. And so with the benefits, first of all, we've been talking about efficacy, and essentially the simple definition is the ability to produce the desired result. And so as Dr. Brar mentioned earlier in the New England Journal of Medicine, the efficacy for this vaccine for COVID is awesome for these two vaccines. And there is a much less likelihood to acquire the disease after receiving the vaccine. And if we just look at the benefits of not getting COVID, that means that personal time isn't lost. That means that the long-term effects, you don't have the ability for the long-term effects. That means the financial loss of the company, of the nation, of personal is less. And so obviously, like, we would like less people to get COVID, and this vaccine has shown that it does reduce the number of people that got exposed and got the symptomatic COVID, as shown earlier by Dr. Brar. Also, we've been shown that it's safe. The safety profile is also excellent. It's as safe, if not safer, than other vaccines that we get. But also, kind of the main point that we want to hurt on is the herd immunity. So even if you get COVID and you know it's not going to be too bad because you don't have a lot of comorbidities, and so you'd just rather take your chances with COVID, there is this thing called herd immunity. And if everyone gets it, it protects the people that can't get it, such as the very young, the very old, and the immunocompromised. And so if there's no way to spread it eventually when we acquire herd immunity, then it protects those people that don't have the ability to get the vaccine or have some sort of immunocompromise, and so they're much more at risk, and much more at risk for those fatal, if not just very serious symptoms. And then we're trying to still figure out how long it can last. Dr. Brar, have you seen how long possibly the vaccine effects can last?
Yeah, so nothing that we know is for certain, obviously, because the vaccine has only been out for a short period of time. One thing we do know is getting reinfected with COVID is a real thing. I personally have colleagues and friends that have gotten reinfected. Right now, what the CDC and other organizations are saying, 90 days to maybe several months is how long your immunity from getting COVID lasts. Some of the Moderna data and studies are showing that the immunity may last up to a year. What we do know, what is likely, is that we will likely need a booster shot. What we don't know is how often we'll need a booster shot. So pretty similar to like our tetanus shots that we get every 5 to 10 years, or in kids that get multiple doses of their MMR vaccines. We will be needing booster shots likely. And as these new, I know in the news that they're talking about these new mutations and new variants of COVID. So far, they're showing that the vaccine we have now should work for those. But in the future, if there is a new strain, this mRNA technology can be done so quickly. We're able to check the genetic code for the different mutations and develop a new vaccine that would cover any potential new mutations that come in the coming years.
Awesome, thank you. And Dr. Salazar, can you explain what in the world this picture is?
So I am a geek, I'm a nerd, and I won't lie to you, I like science quite a bit. So 3 days after getting my second dose, I was very curious to see if I developed IgG. I never had COVID-19. I took every precaution at work and played it extremely safe. So I was always antibody negative when I tested it approximately 6 times doing a study. Now, 3 days after the second vaccine, I paid for this freely available antibody test that requires a single drop of blood from my finger. It takes about 15 minutes. And to answer a question in the chat, so what you're looking at there is the control right there at the top, the C, that just tells you the test is working. And then you see that beautiful IgG line that almost made me tear up that day. Okay, so IgG is kind of the long-term immunity antibody that you develop once you have had the infection or you have the vaccine. IgM is another antibody that we develop in kind of the more acute phase. Yeah, so IgM is something that you develop very close after acquiring the infection and you become symptomatic, and that IgM kind of goes up and it goes down relatively quickly. Now, IgG also begins to go up, okay, but it tends to stick around and it does its thing for quite a while and protects you. So that's exactly what you want to see out of a vaccine. That tells you that somebody who never had COVID-19 was exposed to the spike protein and beautiful IgG began to flow through every drop of my blood, protecting me. So next time that hopefully I never encountered, but if I encounter COVID-19, I will have some good IgG protection to do that. My IgG right now should actually be higher now. So that pink, that's that very light pink line for IgG is going to be a lot more pink now. I might kind of post that on my Instagram account. I'll put my IG there for you at some point. Let's tackle a couple of questions. Dr. Brar, any contraindications for treating hives rash with Benadryl if necessary?
Unless you're allergic to Benadryl, but
Yep, you can use the Benadryl 100%. Dr. Brar, you're getting a little bit of love here. We're gonna tackle this. I appreciate the way you reiterated that getting the vaccine does not mean we can go mask free, which is a common presumption or assumption. So get a shout out there. We're gonna discuss this in the next little bit. All right, next slide, Paul. Okay, all right. Let's go through the myths, and we kind of compile the most common ones. I'll tackle the first one, infertility. This is one of the ones that I have seen mostly on social media. I cannot find a single paper by reputable sources, by scientists, that says there's a correlation between a specific vaccine like the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine and infertility. To be very frank with you, this is not the first time that this claim has been made when a vaccine is developed. There are groups out there who claim this with every vaccine that's developed. I mean, no disrespect to anybody, but we have no scientific evidence that this leads to infertility. Remember, it cannot be said enough. You do not cross the nucleus. You do not affect your DNA. All right, long-term effects. Dr. Brar, you want to reiterate that point for us?
yes. So the long-term effects, like I was saying before, majority of vaccine side effects in the past, with all our past vaccines that have been studied, kind of develop in the first 2 months. But we always want to look at long-term effects for any treatment or vaccine that we have. So the long-term effects are being studied. That's what this phase 4 of the vaccine study is we're going to take a look, and as more and more people get vaccinated, we'll kind of see over term how they do. But so far, everything's pretty encouraging that we've seen. And then I want to talk a little bit more about the DNA kind of aspect of it. So as we were talking about before, the mRNA that's getting injected via the vaccine does not go into our nucleus, does not become a part of our DNA, is not causing any mutations. That mRNA is actually very unstable, and in that previous slide, we were talking about that kind of fat molecule that it sits in. If it wasn't even in that, it would be degraded by our body's enzymes and cells fairly quickly, not even having a chance to enter our cells.
And I'll take some of the next ones. This COVID vaccine, some people are saying that it's microchipping. No, please no, it's not. And the next one is, if you've already had COVID vaccine, you do not need the new vaccine. And I actually can attest to this. I did unfortunately contract COVID, presumably from work, figured it out pretty quickly, got tested, did not see anyone else, spent Christmas from Zoom, and I'm still getting the vaccine as soon as I can get an appointment, which is next week, because your IgG does drop. And so reinfection is real, is possible, especially for us on the front lines that are seeing a COVID patient or multiple every shift. And so you do not need to wait the 90 days that some people have said. As long as you are no longer symptomatic, no longer have COVID, you can get it pretty much immediately. And yeah, whenever you could get an appointment in my case. Can we talk a little bit about the flu vaccine versus the COVID vaccine, Dr. Salazar?
Sure thing, Virginia. Two different mechanisms for sure. We got to remember that the flu vaccine normally uses attenuated, which is kind of dead virus, and then some vaccines actually have a live virus, completely different mechanism of action, but the effect is generally the same. You develop antibodies against the flu vaccine, against the influenza virus. I apologize. Secondarily, you got to remember that every flu vaccine that you take every year, there are several different strains of influenza that roam around. And so the CDC every year predicts which of the strains are going to be most active for that season. And so the vaccine that you have is going to cover you against the most likely strains to be floating around for that season. Okay, so they work exactly the same. One of my concerns kind of going forward is not concern, it's more like looking forward is going to be, now that we have different strains, we have good evidence, as Dr. Broad mentioned, that the current vaccine covers against the few strains that are out there. But going forward, if this virus continues to get out of control like it is in the United States, for every day that virus is out there, it gets smarter and smarter and smarter. You're going to start developing more and more mutant strains out there. And so we may have to do it like we do the flu vaccine every year and get vaccinated. Thank you, Virginia, for that question. I'm going to address two here that I have. There is a question about not utilizing Tylenol for any minor symptoms. There's no indication that you could not use acetaminophen based products like Tylenol for these minor symptoms. You can use ibuprofen, naproxen, or acetaminophen, the ingredient in Tylenol, for your symptoms. And I got an interesting question here. Yeah, definitely the physician in Miami that died from, he actually had a brain hemorrhage. He had thrombocytopenia, which is low platelets, and this happened to be discovered after he received the vaccine. Now, we got to remember, the question is this an actual correlation? Does the vaccination cause his thrombocytopenia? But we can't say that for sure. If you ask me to be honest and have an educated guess at it, there are some conditions that are triggered by viruses themselves, like idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, in which you develop low platelets as a result of a stressor. You can also get another more serious type of low platelets called TTP, and that can be very detrimental to you. I'm wondering if this physician developed ITP or TTP as a result, as a result of the vaccine, developed some thrombocytopenia, and then this happened. On the other hand, he may have had a history of ITP or TTP before. He may have had low platelets. Really, really tough to say. So there's been a lot of talk in the medical community about this case. What we have to remember is keep our head kind of in this direction and figure out that the vaccine does not necessarily mean you develop thrombocytopenia. There are many other things that can cause thrombocytopenia. Thank you for that question. If I might, let's touch upon the PPE item. And I want our panelists to kind of weigh in. I heard, unfortunately, at work from a very respected colleague, a nurse, who said, I don't understand why I get vaccinated and I can't take off my mask at work. I kind of had a little bit of chest pain. I should have asked for some nitroglycerin or something, because that's not the purpose of the vaccine. So Dr. Brar, let's start with you, kind of what your opinion is, and why is it that we can't take off our PPE?
Yeah, I think there's two different aspects to this. One is we wear PPE to protect ourselves from contracting infections such as COVID. And the second thing is we wear PPE to protect those around us, whether it's the people we're working with and our patients. Even if we've been vaccinated, like I was talking before, this study was looking at symptomatic COVID. So we're not sure if we can be asymptomatic carriers or have very, very mild symptoms to the point where we're not noticing, but still be spreading the virus even after you've been vaccinated. So that's one reason to wear PPE. The other is that the vaccine is 95% effective, and you don't know if you're going to be that 5% who didn't develop the antibodies. So in a disease that's prevalent and that in such a large part of the population, you want to be wearing your PPE to protect yourself just in case you aren't part of that 5%. Now, once COVID is, less prevalent, it's not spreading everywhere, it'd probably be safer to go without PPE, but we're just not at that point yet.
I think you're absolutely right. Virginia, from an operational standpoint, are you in agreement that EMS agencies would be very wise to continue pretty aggressive PPE practices?
Absolutely. And I understand the frustrations. I understand it's annoying. I understand you feel like you can't do your job as effectively because there's something on your face all the time. But I think it is very important. And I mean, apparently at one point before I was born, you didn't wear gloves in EMS. And so I think just when we have COVID and before, hopefully in the future, it is way less and herd immunity is reached, I think it's super important to wear the PPE to protect yourself. And even if you're not as worried about yourself, to protect the people around you and your patients, who are often the elderly, the young, and the immunocompromised as well.
Paul, you have been around the block longer as a practicing medic and clinician than any of us. Talk about your experience and how PPE has evolved. Virginia mentioned gloves, for example. We've seen a massive kind of shift in that.
Yeah. So Virginia, I was one of those paramedics who did not wear gloves back in the 80s. And if you remember in the 80s, what came about there was HIV. And so we got scared and we started putting on our gloves, as we realized how deadly HIV was back in the 80s. But to answer your question, Dr. Salazar, we are teaching a lot of classes now. After the Ebola scare here in Dallas, we did a lot of classes for our initial paramedic students about the importance of PPE and protecting themselves from something as deadly as Ebola. And little did we know, a couple years later, we'd be experiencing another pandemic. Of course, Ebola wasn't a pandemic, but this one is. And now all of a sudden, people are using those lessons that we taught about the importance of PPE now in this pandemic. And so again, wearing things like goggles and surgical masks or N95s, whatever your policy is in your agency, and gowns, is really something that's really important for us to do. As Virginia said, is it cumbersome? Is it hot? Can you get hypoxic? Yeah, sure. It really sucks, but the perk of that, the benefit is that we come back home to our family and we're not infected and we don't infect our family. And those are really, really important things. You know, another related concept of PPE is this concept of an EMS scout, where we have a single person go in and do some assessment on those patients that we suspect could have COVID. And we reduce the number of people that are exposed to these patients. And then, you know, practicing things like procedures that reduce aerosolizing the things that we do, like nebulizers and those things. I mean, we're in a whole new world as to how we practice as EMS as a result of this virus.
Thank you, Paul. We always appreciate your perspective, and yeah, definitely we've seen a massive shift, and I can predict, maybe an uneducated guess, but I can safely predict that going forward in EMS operation and hospital operations, universal masking with a surgical mask is going to be the standard of care going forward, just like gloves became the standard of care very quickly.
I think it's really odd. You know, we truly in olden days, we did give infectious diseases a lot of credit when we did those lectures in paramedic school. And I don't know, you know, we came in and did the song and dance, hey, I got scene safety and PPE and all that kind of stuff. But I think we're going to take this a whole lot more serious because of what we just experienced. And so I think the infectious disease lectures, the public health lectures, and the PPE lectures are going to be a whole lot more important for our future providers.
Absolutely. Let's tackle a couple of questions in the last few minutes of the webinar. Is the vaccine safe for those who have post-acute COVID syndrome, still getting tachycardia, shortness of breath, fatigue? Yeah, it is perfectly safe to do that. We're learning a little bit about this long hauler syndrome, as it's being called. And so to put more kind of pathophysiology behind it, we're finding something called COVID-associated pulmonary fibrosis. You know, we see pulmonary fibrosis as a congenital disease in patients, and to some degree those with kind of exposures to carcinogens, etc. And to see a virus that is causing this pulmonary fibrosis, leading to long-term symptoms, including the fatigue and the shortness of breath that you're mentioning, is pretty scary. And you know, I hear a lot of rhetoric. Well, you know, the mortality rate is only less than 1%, but yet out of this number of survivors, I don't want to walk around with pulmonary fibrosis the rest of my life. I may have absolutely no symptoms and no sequelae, no consequences of this, but to me, that's a pretty scary thing to have. So thank you for your question. It is perfectly safe for you to receive the vaccine if you've had this type of long hauler syndrome. Let's take a look at this other question. What's the age range for these vaccines? The age range, 18 and older. These studies were not studied in children. There are ongoing studies right now to look at kids between the age of 12 and 17. As a matter of fact, they're having a little bit of trouble recruiting for these individuals, for these kids. And so there's a lot of hesitation on the public. I'll tell you this. When I heard that they were recruiting for kids and I opened up that invitation for volunteers, I was secretly hoping the age would be 11 after consulting with my daughter, and she would be more than willing to do it because it is a valuable aspect of public health. Unfortunately, the cutoff was 12. So it's being studied in children. I really suspect that very soon we will have enough data to be able to vaccinate young children. All right, thank you for your question. Let's talk about false age range. What is IgG? Post-acute syndrome. Let's talk about false positives. Do we really have a problematic pandemic? What is wrong with our own immune system? I'm going to preface what I'm going to say is, like, remember, I have my role as clinician, as an EMS professional, as a physician, is to keep myself and the public safe. And I can tell you that our immune systems have had no exposure in our lives to this exact virus. And so for our country to see this number of deaths. And, you know, we can talk all we want about what caused what, but at the end of the day, 400,000 deaths, Americans, hardworking Americans, that's pretty scary. That's really, really sad. The positivity rate, which is the percentage of tests that come back positive, an acceptable level in a pandemic should be less than 5%, tops 10% or 12%. In our community right now, we're seeing a positivity rate of 31%. So 31% of tests that we see are positive. Are some of those false positives? Yeah, but it tells you a lot about kind of where we are, and it's out of control. The one item that I wanted to mention is that people talk about herd immunity. Yes, herd immunity is the real deal, but at no point in our lifetimes have we seen herd immunity be achieved without vaccines. So there's already examples out there in the world, for example, in Brazil, where close to 80% of people have had COVID-19 and they're still in the middle of a pandemic. Their positivity rate is high. So we know that without a vaccine, just natural exposure to the virus is not enough to give us the protection that we absolutely need. So thank you for your question. mRNA has been tried. Why no successful vaccines before? Money, that's a big one. Agencies, we now have a reason to do it. So mRNA has been around for a very long time. Okay, 99.9 recovery rate is serious. Okay, all right, thank you.
And Dr. Salazar,
Sure.
mRNA technology has been used in cancer patients.
On cancer patients?
Yes.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that not only has this technology been used on patients with for vaccinations, but there is some history of this being used for patients who have cancer. And so some of the technology that's being developed for cancer patients is pretty incredible. And this is one of the pieces. And as you mentioned earlier in the slide set, you know, the technology, the mRNA technology is not new. It's just really gotten a lot more attention in the last 10 years.
Oh, for sure. You know, the cancer treatment community has been using this technology for a while, but now to use it against a specific virus in a pandemic, that's pretty cool. We are actually 1 o'clock. I could spend all day here speaking with you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I want to thank CareerCert. I want to thank Wendy for hosting it. I want to thank Dr. Brar. I want to thank Dr. Paul Rosenberger. I want to thank Ms. Virginia Smith for your time. And remember, we're not in the business of politicizing any of this or thinking kind of what's the right thing, what isn't, but we wanted to present a scientific evidence-based approach to how you look at the vaccine. And it is our consensus that it is a safe and effective way of keeping our medics safe, our community safe, our healthcare personnel safe, and we hope that you found it useful. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Salazar, and thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your thoughts and personal experiences. Also, thank you everyone for joining us today for this important conversation. We'd love to continue the conversation with you, so visit us at careercert.com for more webinars, free resources, and other help to best protect yourself, your fellow providers, and your patients. Thanks again for connecting with us today, and thank you for all the work that you do to make our communities safer places. Take care.